Well, hello. I wanted to share with you today just a quick video, kind of an introduction to something that I have done in the way of biblical interpretation. And I've created a rather simple format. It's actually one that I developed years ago when I was teaching hermeneutics in a local Christian school. And I did so because I found that many of the formulas that are tools that are out there are sometimes a little difficult to use, a little cumbersome. And so for my high school students, I put together what I would call a rather simple formula to work with. There's only 4 steps. And what I want to do is share that with you. In fact, I've put all of this into a workbook, and it's on Amazon. In fact, I'll try to leave a link for it on this video. But it's a way to help you at least increase the odds of getting it right. You know, one of the great problems, interpretive mistakes people make, is they look at a passage, they read a passage, and I call this, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I call this youth group hermeneutics. They're in the youth group, the youth leader reads a verse, and the question he always asks, or she will ask, is, what does this mean, you know the rest of it, to you? And I used to tell my students, what it means to you is really irrelevant if you don't know what it means. So what I'd like to do today is just kind of give you a quick overview of the process, and then in later videos I'll actually take it step by step. I use the acronym CALM, C-A-L-M, CALM, and I use my little saying is, you can be calm when interpreting the Bible. Because, like I said, one of the things we don't want to do is get into the habit of reading a text and then jumping forward to, and what that means to me is, because what it means to me may be wrong. It may not even be in the neighborhood of what the author had in mind. And that's where, like I said, a lot of bad theology comes out of that. People will claim promises that aren't really promises, and build expectations on promises that aren't really promises. And when it doesn't happen, what happens? They get angry. They get frustrated with God. And I don't want to see that happen. So let me introduce these really quick. And like I said, in subsequent videos, we'll take it in greater detail. C stands for context. So what is the context of the verse or the passage? Now I'll say from the outset, most passages cannot be interpreted correctly just by looking at 1 or 2 verses. The only exception to that would be Proverbs. Now, many of the sayings in Proverbs can be interpreted based on whatever the saying is. But apart from that, most passages cannot be interpreted correctly just by looking at 1 verse. You have to look at the verses preceding and the verses that follow. Especially if there's conditions in the passage, or if there's terms like therefore or because. That means it's connecting what was previously said with what the writer was about to say. Conditions are important. Anytime you read a verse, and I know there's some verses people like to jump on and make promises out of, and put them on the refrigerator and give bold confessions based on that promise. The only problem is they skip over the conditions. And if you're reading a verse that says probably the 2 of the biggest words in the Bible, most important words in the Bible, are if and but. And so when you see in a passage where it says, if you do this, then this will happen, you need to remember the if. There's a condition. Or if you're reading a passage that makes a statement and says, but this, then you need to take that into consideration. Not everything is a promise. And even with promises, you need to make sure that the promise is for you and not just for the reader. I know that there's verses that people like to pull out, like in the Old Testament especially, that were given to one individual, and then they want to pull it out and apply it to everyone. And you have to be careful doing that. Not every promise applies to everyone. So C is context. What is the literary context? That's the verses around the passage that you're interpreting. And what is the external context, which will be the social factors, political factors. What was it that was going on that motivated the author to write? You need to know that because that's going to play a role in how you interpret the passage. Was there some type of a threat? Now, this is where we need to keep in mind that the Bible is based on covenant, that the Old Testament and New Testament are based on the concept of covenant, that God relates to people through covenant. And there are covenant promises that apply to people who are in covenant with God. But we have two different covenants. In the Old Testament, you have the old covenant between God and Israel, and then in the new covenant, you have the covenant between God and humanity, or everyone who places their faith in Jesus Christ, who was the mediator of the new covenant. The old covenant was set up where it was based largely on what we could call the Hittite covenant outline. And what the Hittites would do, they didn't want to occupy anybody. And so they would go in, and when they conquered a people, they would get the leaders and they would have a ceremony and they would make a covenant. And then the covenant, it would open by praising the Hittites as the superior power, and then it would mention the people who were conquered as the lesser powers. It called them Susarians. And it created, the covenant then created almost a familial relationship where the greater would be like the parent and the conquered people would be like the child. And then the greater would set forth blessings or things they would do, their duties they would do if the captured people were faithful to them, and it would also identify consequences, or in biblical sense, curses, if they were unfaithful to them. And then they would go through this elaborate ceremony of signifying that this covenant was open-ended. There would be no end until the greater power no longer existed. And so the Bible writers took that model to help conceptualize the covenant in the Old Testament, between God and Israel. So you'll see this in Israel's history a lot, that when they were faithful to God, God blessed them. When they were unfaithful to God, God sent consequences. The one thing that usually got an immediate response from God was idolatry. Now, he might let some other things go for a while, some other sins they were committing, other violations of the covenant, he might let slide. But when they got into idolatry, they got a quick response. And usually the response was repent or else. And if they went for the or else, that's when these other nations would come in and occupy. So in the Old Testament, you see several who will come in and occupy Israel at some point, and we'll get into that more so when we get to that particular video. So keep this in mind. What's going on politically, socially, spiritually? Were the people in good shape, or were they away from the Lord? I can pretty much tell you when you get into the prophets, they're away from the Lord, because most of the prophets are corrective in nature. So that's context. A is author, audience. So who wrote it and who was he writing to? Now I'm going to give you a hint here. He was not writing to us. We were not the primary audience, and I'm sorry to tell you that, but you've got to depersonalize the interpretive process. The writers of the Bible, Paul was not writing to us. He did not have us in mind. He had somebody in mind. And he was writing to these people for a reason. So that's why it's important to understand why he was writing to these people and how he wrote to these people. For example, with Paul, he uses a very Romanesque type style in that he conceptualizes the Christian life and a relationship with God through a legal type arrangement that sin has separated from God, has made us guilty in the court of heaven. But when we place our faith in Christ alone, He justifies us, or He declares us innocent before God because He takes the penalty of sin on Himself. See, that's all a very legal oriented concept of what the Christian life is should look or is. And then he would get into how we should respond to that, which is where he would get into things like personal conduct, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And all of this went back to this relationship between God and humanity that was more or less a legal structure. Now, when you get into John's writings, he's totally different. John was not writing in a Romanesque style, he was writing in a Gnostic style because he's writing to refute the Gnostics. John writes late in the first century, and by that time, the Judaizers are gone, which was the main group that Paul had to deal with. And the primary threat to Christian doctrine then was Gnosticism. And by the way, it still is, but it goes by other names, and we'll get into that later. But that's why some of John's writings are somewhat difficult to get through because what does it mean to say that Jesus is bread, is water, the Spirit is wind, and you see all these images that he uses in his writings, both in his gospel and in his epistles. And what about in the epistles where he writes things like, if we say we have no sin, we lie. And if we say we're in the light and we continue to sin, we're in the dark. And, I mean, some of that stuff, if you approach it like you would approach Paul's writings, you just have to sit there and scratch your head and say, well, my goodness, I guess every time I sin, I'm lost again. And that's not John's style. John is writing to people who have bought into Gnostic theology, which stated sin is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're trying to be spiritual, that you're pursuing spirituality. And as long as you're pursuing spiritual things and spiritual awareness and spiritual mindedness, what you do in the body is irrelevant. So that's who he's writing to. He's writing to people, and that's why he reminds him sin very much matters. And it's you're not, as the Gnostics said, everybody's not good with God. Everybody's not on the path to true spirituality, that there is no true spirituality apart from Christ. So, totally different thing, totally different audience, and a totally different style. That's where author audience comes into play. L stands for literary analysis. So, literary analysis includes defining the genre of literature, which matters. If you're dealing with poetic literature, like much of the wisdom literature, you have to interpret it one way. Whereas if you're dealing with historical literature, like 2nd or 1st Samuel, you'll interpret it differently. A big reason is poetic literature typically uses a lot of imagery, and you have to interpret the imagery correctly. I mentioned Proverbs a minute ago. One of the difficulties with Proverbs is it includes colloquialisms that we may not know what the meaning actually was. And so we might have to do a little research to find out, well, what did this really mean when Solomon wrote it? Because he had something in mind when he wrote it. So what did that really mean? You have to know the genre of literature. Another thing you have to do is, as you look at the passage, do you see figures of speech that were used? Do you see some things might be hyperbole? Hyperbole means you kind of take it over the top. For example, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Now, I don't know any Christians who do that. And yet, I know a lot of Christians who have problems with lust, which is the context where that was stated. So, we've already decided, well, that wasn't literally what Jesus had in mind. Okay, so we're dealing with a figure of speech. We need to know that. Jesus often used figures of speech where in occasions where people would come to him and they would say, "Okay, I've kind of got it figured out. The bar's kind of right here, and I'm about to get over that." And then when he would get a hold of it, he would bump the bar way on up here where they would never get over it. And that's something we need to be able to interpret. And keep in mind that if he's using, or if the author's using figures of speech, we have to interpret those to get at the real meaning and not just blow it off or skip over it or resort to saying, well, what that means to me is this. So another thing, you may have to define some terms. Now, there's not a lot of that, and today with the internet, that's simple. That's in fact, getting commentaries is simple. Now, one of the things I would recommend is find a commentary you can actually read and understand. Some of them are older and they write in a very technical style that makes it difficult to wade through it sometimes. So, a good study Bible might be helpful. Now, by a good study Bible, I don't mean life application. Uh, a life application Bible is just that. It gives you ways to apply what you've read. But something like a Bible that focuses on context or historical things, one of those type Bibles, they can be very helpful with this. All right, so that's CAL. All right, so we've got three of them down. Last one is M, meaning. And by that, I mean, what is the historical meaning of the passage? So, again, you got to do a little homework, get on the internet, look up somebody that you have confidence in. There's some people on there that obviously you would not want to rely on what they have to say. If you put in a Google search and it pops up, Bubba's opinion on the Bible. Well, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in that one. So it might not hurt to go ahead and have some sources bookmarked in your computer that you know are reliable. And when something comes up, go to it. Two websites that can be very helpful, and I would encourage you to bookmark these. I've got them bookmarked in everything I own. One of them is BibleHub.com, and the other one is BibleGateway.com. Now, I probably use Bible Gateway more, but I recommend this in my church all the time. That people bookmark this and use it. If you want to hear the Bible read to you, Bible Gateway offers that service with many different translations. So I would bookmark these in your phone, in your computer, whatever you have. So, what is the historical meaning? Now, whatever the historical meaning is, and you can check out 2 or 3 sources, and like I said, it's really easy now, just doing a Google search. That will kind of give you a sense of direction in what you're going to conclude as the meaning of the passage. So now we're done. So you look at the context, you look at the author audience, you look at literary analysis, you kind of figure out what you discovered working that way. You've probably already come up with some type of a preliminary hypothesis of what it means. Okay, compare that with what these sources said. Do these sources agree with what you said? If they are reliable sources, then I would put stock in what they say. So, what's a reliable source? Matthew Henry's commentaries is probably one of the basics. You have Calvin's commentaries, you have John Wesley's commentaries, people like that. Those are the kind of people you can have a little more confidence in. So once you see that, and you've got all the pieces of the puzzle, all that is required now is putting the puzzle together. And when you do, you'll come up with a meaning. Now, again, your meaning, whatever you come up with, should conform to the overall meaning of the Bible. So if I read a chapter and I say, wow, based on this chapter, that means that we can earn salvation through good works. Mm-mm. No, that contradicts the entire message of the Bible. So I can throw that one out and start over. If you read a chapter and say, "Wow, that means if my neighbor doesn't want to respond to my evangelistic presentation, I can kill them." Mm, no. The one that really gets used a lot, unfortunately, is the Lord told me to leave my spouse and go off with someone else who's more spiritual. No, that's not in there. Sorry. Whatever your interpretation is, it's got to line up with the interpretation, with the whole of Scripture. So if you take it progressively, if I'm looking at a verse or a couple of verses, my interpretation of those verses need to fit with the chapter, what's going on in the chapter. Whatever I say is going on in the chapter needs to fit with what the book's about. If I come up with something different, something that's contrary to the overall message of the Bible, I'm wrong. And I need to go back and do it again. Now, once you've done all that, that's when you get to application. So, in light of what this text means and what the author was saying to the original audience, is he saying anything to me too? Is there a principle there that applies to me? Is there a promise in there that applies to me? That's when you do the application part and say, what that means to me is. Now, see, that's a whole different world than just reading a verse and saying, okay, what that means to me is this. Because what that means to me, I can tell you what it's going to mean to me is what I want it to mean to me. And that's just the way our opinions get into it. And so I just encourage you to watch the other videos as they come up. I'm through number 3, I believe. So there should be 3 of them out there. And I will put the link to the workbook that's on Amazon if you're interested in downloading that. I think there's an e-copy and a paperback copy. All right. Thank you very much.